Hey, I'm Jeffrey Masters, and let's be blunt. It is a very, very scary time right now for the trans community. I don't think I need to list all the reasons why, all the attacks that are taking place. But one stat that I think about a lot is that in 2020, there were just over 100 bills introduced in the US targeting LGBTQ people. So that's 100 bills in 2020, right? But in 2025, so far this year, there have already been 850 bills, the vast majority of which specifically target the trans community. It's frightening, and for all those reasons and more, I was really interested in talking to Susan Stryker about how we got here and how she's thinking about this current moment. Susan is an academic and a historian, one of the most celebrated in the community, I should say. She is a foundational figure when it comes to transgender studies and is the author of the book titled Transgender History. Her most recent book is a collection of her essays and work called When Monsters Speak. In our conversation, I think that Susan gives one of the most compelling answers I've heard to the question of why so many people hate and seem to be so threatened by the existence of trans people. This is something that we've talked a lot about on the show, and I think that Susan really shines a light and gives a clarity to why these attacks are taking place. So without further ado, this is LGBT Q&A with Susan Stryker. We recorded in person just a couple of weeks ago in New York City. So I got to know your work as a historian and an academic after you'd already reached this level of notoriety. But I did not know how hard it was originally for you to get a job after you got your PhD. Talk about what was going on during that time.
We're in a very difficult moment historically right now, so everything, I think, pales in comparison to the present. But in the early 90s, when I was just wrestling with the fact that it's I really need to transition if I want to go on in life, the climate for doing that was not good. Trans people were still psychopathologized, were listed in the, DSM as having an identity disorder. It was very easy to be criminalized. We had no civil rights, no employment protections. And there was, a great deal of, I would say, ignorance and stigma. I mean, there still is, but this is pre-tipping point, pre-2014, when, I think there was a big upsurge in visibility to trans issues. So to transition was kind of to fall off the edge of the cliff, that you just walked outside the map of most people's realities. And I think a lot of the assumptions about trans women in particular is you're going to be standing on a street corner shaking your ass, and that's what your job is going to be. And, that was not exactly the right milieu in which to expect to, say, become a professor of early 19th century U.S. religious history.
That's what you were studying?
Yeah, I actually wrote my dissertation on early Mormon history. But, like I said, I was not the right kind of person to be hired in higher education in spite of my training because of anti-trans prejudice.
And how long did that last?
17 years.
You were outside of that academy for 17 years?
Yeah, I would joke about it and say if I don't get a tenure-track job in 20 years of trying, I'm just going to throw in the towel and try a different career. I would apply every year for jobs. And, the academic job market is tough. I mean, it's a crapshoot for everybody. But it was almost like it was kind of like a Zen exercise in absurdity. It's I will apply for jobs that I am well qualified for, and I will just use the yearly exercise of writing those job letters as a way to, meditate, stay grounded.
Torture yourself?
Yeah, a little reality check. So it was very hard for a few years. I call the first 7 years after I transitioned as my unpaid internship in transgender studies. I had a friend who joked about it when I first came out to him, a friend from graduate school. I said, I'm transitioning. And he says, that's a gutsy career move. And, I got really angry at him. I was like, this isn't a career move. This is my life. But in retrospect, it did become a career as well as an identity, to help try to change gender. I mean, I think that's what my whole adult career has been about, is like trying to change what gender means and does and make it something that's less coercive or punitive and more a space of agency and freedom for people.
I do want to talk about Transgender Nation, if that's okay.
Sure.
We just have talked about like Gay Activist Alliance and Gay Liberation Front, all these short-lived gay groups, but we've talked less about like the trans activist groups. How did you get involved with them originally?
It has to do directly with me doing community-based archival and historical work. So, there I was, a soon-to-be freshly minted PhD from Berkeley with like zero prospect of, job. And I just showed up at the local, what was then called Gay and Lesbian Historical Society, and just like, hi, I'm unemployed, have time on my hands, I'm hustling, I'm networking, I want to put my skills to use somehow. I want to learn the trans history of San Francisco. I want to dig into this archive. And they said, great, one of our founding members, this guy Lou Sullivan, died recently, and we have his papers. And it's like, why don't you learn how to be an archivist by archiving Lou's papers?
Oh, so just for the audience, Lou's a legendary trans man.
Lou is a legendary trans man.
And what was radical at the time, he was a legendary trans gay man.
Correct.
Which was a scandal, let's say.
Right, right. And he was one of the founding members of the Gay and Lesbian Historical Society.
I had a lot of problems with the gender professionals saying there is no such thing as a female to gay male, and you can't live like this, and we've never heard of that. And when I got diagnosed and I thought, I've got 10 months to live, and they're going to hear about this before I kick off, and I don't want, other people coming into their clinics in 2 years saying they feel that way and getting the same line that I did, that they never heard of this and this isn't an authentic thing.
Yeah. I call Lou my posthumous transition buddy, because like I was transitioning, in a trans feminine direction and identify as a trans lesbian. And so to read Lou's journals, it's like, I know this isn't what the question you asked me, but Lou started journaling when he was 10 years old. I mean, he was like a 10-year-old Catholic school girl in suburban Milwaukee, and some of those early journals, they say things like, when we got home, we played boys. It was fun. But he started journaling at 10, and he kept journaling until he was 40. He died when he was 39, but it's like close to being 40 years old. So there's about 30 years of journals that document in a really intimate, interesting, thoughtful way a lifelong relationship to changing gender. And, it just to be privy to someone else's thoughts and feelings and to be able to do the compare and contrast. It's like, oh, that's what Lou was going through, at this time and this place. And that was like me doing this at that time and that place. So it just, I felt like I developed a very intimate bond with Lou posthumously. So I had done that work on making Lou's papers available for research use and was going around and publicizing it. And there was a group called FTM, Female to Male, that Lou had founded that still existed after his death. And it was mostly for trans men, but every other month they would have an open informational meeting that was just open to the community. And I went to that one to say, hey, y'all, historian here, Lou's papers are available. I mean, people can go and, look at them. It's amazing. And at that meeting was a woman named Anne Ogborn, who was a trans woman. And she was there to say, hey, we're going to organize a caucus in Queer Nation called Transgender Nation. And so for those who don't remember Queer Nation, it was one of the two major AIDS activist organizations in the late 80s and early 90s. But in San Francisco, the Queer Nation chapter, they would just, invite affinity groups to form. It's like, okay, this is Queer Nation, but within Queer Nation, there might be the group called Labia, lesbians and bisexuals in action, or people who were interested in, there was one called SHOP, Suburban Homosexual Outreach Project, And so Transgender Nation was just the affinity group within Queer Nation for working on trans issues. Anne shows up, says like, hey, we're forming this group. And I was like, great, that's what I'm here for. Like, let me get involved with that. And so, I Transgender Nation was important to me as a place to say, like, yes, I am meeting other political trans people, and we are trying to figure out how to have a trans politics that is both in alignment with gay and lesbian and queer politics and AIDS activism, but we want to do it from a trans perspective, because there was still, and there still is, unfortunately, a lot of people who are okay with the L and G and maybe the B, but like don't want the T to be a part of that. So that was definitely the case in the early 90s as well.
I know that's a vocal group of people like today, but I also think it's a vocal minority. I don't think it's anywhere near majority opinion.
I think that's true. But,
Okay.
Like I will also say that's like, say, working in museum spaces or with, national boards of organizations. It's like I still run into cisgender gay and lesbian men of a certain age who just really, don't want to be associated with the gender trash. And maybe they won't say that out loud, but, actually maybe they're saying it a little more loudly than they would have a couple of years ago.
It's so interesting hearing that and reading about it because I'm 36 and I came of age being a proud member of the LGBTQ community, and I didn't know there was like any debate. I just thought we were all one community and it was accepted fact.
Isn't that a lovely thought?
I don't think that I'm unusual like that, though.
I think that is true. And that there is a generational cohort that's going like, duh, like one big boat. Like, what are we, like, what's the problem?
Yeah. But along these lines, though, I want to read something that you wrote. You say this. In many respects, the transgender movement's politics towards the medical establishment were more like those of the reproductive justice movement than those of the gay liberation movement. Transgender people, like people seeking abortions or contraception, wanted secure access to competent, legal, respectfully provided medical services. And then you say, the decision to seek medical intervention in a deeply personal matter about how to live in one's own body was typically arrived at only after intense and often emotionally painful deliberation. That idea of having the trans movement having more in common with the reproductive rights movement, is that an observation you've only had in hindsight, or is that like an active debate that was taking place?
Well, certainly for me, it was in hindsight, just because of my age. I mean, like in the early 70s, when I think some of those things were up, it's like, like I was in like junior high school. But, I do think it's true. I think the major issue for trans people, particularly trans people who embrace some kind of medical technology to transition, and not everybody does. I mean, I really want to resist the conflation of being trans with embracing a medicalized trans identity or having a medicalized transition, because it's bigger than that. But particularly for trans people who do something medicalized to change their bodies, I do think the major issue is about bodily autonomy and about respectful access to competently provided medical services. So in that sense, I think changing sex is much more like getting abortion than like getting a blowjob, to put it really crudely.
Please do, yeah.
That it's not as much about sexuality as it is about saying my body, my right to decide.
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating in a tragic way that like since then, trans rights have gone the same way as abortion rights in terms of like depending on what state you live in,
right?
Your access to abortion, depending on what state you live in, it could be like the safest place in the world to be trans or like one of the least safe places.
Yeah, exactly. And what I see as a historian looking back is that 1973 was a really important year. I mean, that's not one of the years that we usually think of as like, 1776 or, 1492, like a big symbolically important year like that. We don't think of 1973 being one of those years, but I think that is the year that the world order shifted in a more neoliberal direction of austerity, downsizing the government, making everybody responsible for their own economic decisions. It's not like the state's going to step in and save something. We're going to privatize this and, abolish that. So that mindset really sets in around 1973. And in the context of those big geopolitical, socioeconomic transitions towards neoliberalism that we're seeing in 73, identity politics changes a lot. One of the things that happens in 73 is that you get both Roe v. Wade and you get the formal depathologization of homosexuality in the DSM. And so all of a sudden in this new political context, you still got trans people looking to access medical care. You're still trans people still looking to depathologize their identities, but they no longer have gay liberation or feminist support for those things because it's like the women's movement's like, great, we've got, abortion rights. The gay movement's like, great, we've depathologized homosexuality. And there's trans people still needing those same things.
Yeah.
Still needing depathologization and access to health care. But they're part of a much smaller movement now. And you start to see trans people getting kicked out of broader political movements in 73. Famously, that's the year that Sylvia Rivera, who was one of the most ardent trans and gay liberationists of her generation, it's like being refused the stage at Christopher Street commemoration of the Stonewall riots in Washington Square Park.
There's a famous speech she made there.
The famous, y'all better quiet down speech.
Y'all better quiet down. I've been trying to get up here all day for your gay brothers and your gay sisters in jail that write me every motherfucking week and ask for your help. And you all don't do a goddamn thing for them.
Is there, again, I'm all for this sort of inclusion, to state that. Is there a good reason, other than bigotry, but is there a good reason that trans people should not have been included in this LGB community?
Yeah, I don't think so. No, historically, you look back, there's always been a lot of conflation between three different ways of thinking about these issues. Ideas about homosexuality, transgender, and intersex. Why do people want to have, same-sex relationships? Is it because they're a normal man wanting to be with a normal man, except for their sexuality, a normal woman with a normal woman? And so you think about it in terms of sexuality's desire identity. Or do they want that because they're really a man trapped in a woman's body or a woman trapped in a man's body? Or are they doing that because there's something physically anomalous about them? Is there a biological cause that they're intersex somehow? Anyway, I think that those three ways of thinking about a similar set of problems, it's of course they're going to be related. They're going to share a history in social movements. They're going to share a history in medical management of bodies. They're going to share a history in legal discrimination, policing. So, yeah, it's we are all in the same boat, and there's plenty of overlaps in how intersex, trans, and homo fit together.
And then the population of people that are both, right? Trans and queer.
Right.
I think that we've kind of educated the public that gender and sexuality are two different things. Mm-hmm. And I feel like we have to remind people that they are also intimately intertwined.
Right.
Right. And we can really forget that.
Right. I think there's been much more focus on, gender is not the same thing as sexuality, and sex is not the same thing as gender. And, many of us have become very adroit at, parsing these distinctions between things. But yeah, I think it's also important, as you were just saying, to remember that it's all kind of a tangled hairball, and when you cough up one thing, you're going to be coughing up something else along with it.
Thank you for that metaphor. Yeah. That really goes to something that you write about, which is that in order to get access to medical services, which not all trans people want, but for people who do, that depends on trans people, quote, constructing transgender phenomena as symptoms of a medical illness or physical malady, partly because sickness is the condition that typically legitimizes medical intervention. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is a great tension point. So I ask you, like, is there a way of, like, talking or thinking about being trans that, like, would get around that?
For me, that's why I think the bodily autonomy framework is so important. I don't want to predicate my sense of being a free person in the world on I have the correct diagnosis and I'm recognized by some established social authority. I mean, the medical question is really interesting to me. It's really deep, and it's a complicated set of feelings to address because I think there really is suffering for trans people as well as, a sense of, joy and pleasure and the sublime in being trans. But that suffering, the idea that you reduce suffering by calling it a sickness and receiving a certain kind of treatment, that's a social organization of making the suffering that somebody feels very individual, like it is a personal thing that you are suffering and you can be cured of that or that can be fixed, rather than saying maybe the suffering that you are experiencing with a sense of, gender dysphoria has to do with social organization. Like it has to do with like how families are constituted. It has to do with, social attitudes about men and women. It has to do with sexism and misogyny and racism and classism. And that the suffering that we feel is rooted not in some individual psychological malady, but that it's an experience of living in an unjust world that lands on you in a particular way. I think about an old film from early days of gay liberation by Rosa von Braunheim, who was a German filmmaker, who said, "It is not the homosexual who is sick, but the society that condemns him." There's a lot in that.
I think there's also like a Sylvia Rivera quote that like, I'm not crazy, it's the world that has made me crazy.
Yeah.
I want to drag us back to Transgender Nation.
Drag it back.
Okay. This was a subgroup, as we said, in Queer Nation, but then it did spin off, and I believe it might have outlived Queer Nation.
It outlived Queer Nation, yeah. Transgender Nation was started in 1992 as an affinity group within Queer Nation, which, I think Queer Nation lasted only for about 2 years before it just kind of dissipated. And so, Transgender Nation outlived that, and it was around, I would say, like 1992 through, on paper, like 1995.
So talk to me about what kind of work they did and what their goals were, because Queer Nation was known for being this like militant confrontational group. Did Transgender Nation take that ethos in with it?
Yeah, it did. And I would say I was just one member of Transgender Nation, and in some ways I was on the periphery of it because I lived in Oakland, and it was very San Francisco-based. Sometimes they would call me, Transgender Nation Oakland, But a lot of the work that the group did, it sort of had two foci, I would say. One of them was working within existing LG or LGB organizations to say like, hey, what about the trans piece? And a lot of that had to do with people wrestling over what this newly energized word queer meant. Because, queer had been around for a long time but was considered pejorative. And it's in the later 80s, early 90s that there's this new politicized sense of queer as not exactly gay or lesbian, like it was some broader kind of critique of heteronormativity in society. And so the trans piece was to say, well, this is queer too. Like trans is a different way of critiquing, reacting against, imagining otherwise than the heteronormative matrix that's out there. So Transgender Nation would like show up at like community meetings and say that, like the general membership meeting of some organization or a public town hall or something. And they would be very disruptive, maybe like blowing whistles or whatever to say like, if this is not a place where queer and trans work is happening, then it's like you are part of the old guard, and so there was a more contestatory politics within what was then predominantly gay and lesbian and anxiously bi community for like trans people kind of elbowing their way into it.
So their activism was pointed towards our community.
Right, as well as outwards. And so they were, also doing things like participating in Cop Watch, like doing like community-based surveillance of policing in the community, or doing courtroom support work for people who'd been arrested, like just showing up. Somebody's been arrested for solicitation or cross-dressing or what have you, to show up at their court dates and just let them know that, people were watching and paying attention to them. Oh, so the question that you asked me was about what was Transgender Nation's agenda and goals. And it's like they didn't have one. It was just pushing back against whatever felt like it was trying to step on us somehow and make more space for being trans.
For you personally, as a smart person, as somebody with like a PhD,
having a PhD doesn't mean you're a smart person. Okay. I will just say.
Okay, so let me take the smart out. Having a PhD, do you think that?
No, I am a smart person.
All right. Okay, well, there's one of us.
Okay.
Did that legitimize your transness in people's minds, you think?
No.
It didn't?
No. I mean, if anything, I think it took away from street cred. That I was a different kind of trans in the early 90s, like I'll just say that.
Different how?
Well, so even into the early 90s, there was still this sense of something that Sandy Stone wrote about in her essay, The Post-Transsexual Manifesto, where she says it's hard to develop a counter-discourse when you are programmed to disappear. So the idea was if you're going to transition, then, you should like cut off ties with, previous life, new name, new city, create a plausible backstory for your life. You should be very cis-passing, as they say today.
Live stealth and find no community.
Right. Disappear into the woodwork. In the slang term for it was woodworking. You were expected to woodwork. So that was still very much the case in the early 90s. And, there was the sense that, to be trans, and particularly to be a trans woman and to be visible as a trans woman, meant you were consigning yourself to a illicit street economy of some kind. So there was no real sense of you could be out and trans and professional and have a different critical and political vocabulary for talking about your experience other than this either like personalized language of suffering. Ever since I was a small child, I always felt like an X, but I was a Y. But then I got help, and now I'm happy. Like that was kind of like the only story available to us. And there was very much that sense for me in the 90s of like, why are we playing a game that we are not positioned to win? It's like, this is a game that you can never win at. So like, why are you playing? Why are you agreeing to the ways that trans lives are being channeled and repressed and contained and diminished? It's just like, that's just a losing game. And so like, just like, find a different game to play, start a different conversation, build a different community, make the world different around you through how you put yourself out into the world and relate to others and start to build a new set of social relations. It's just like, don't play the game in which you are destined to lose.
Wow. Going back to now, in 2016, you wrote that it would be remarkable if we didn't have a backlash to like the progress we'd made since at that time for trans people, and that has come to fruition, as we know. Why did you predict that? Is that just because that is how U.S. history has worked always with backlashes, or is there something else?
Well, as a historian, I'm always reluctant to say always or never. What I did see is that, I don't think that all of the negative attention that is coming to trans people right now is strictly like a manipulative distraction from other things. It's like I do think there's something structural at play. I think the way that I think about it most deeply is that I want to think of transness as a practice of freedom. It's a way of saying like, I am like this, just like I didn't ask for it, but I am, and this is me. And, I'm not asking for more than anybody else in the world, but I don't expect, not willing to settle for less. It's like there's this sense of, I just want to like take up my space for me and not be repressed because of that. But that what's at stake in manifesting a trans identity, it really does unsettle some very deep assumptions within the modern Western world about what our bodies mean. Like there's this belief, this ideological belief. It's like, oh, the body is this thing that secures your place in the social order. It's like, that's your body. That's what it means. That means you go in this category, not that category. There's something permanent and unchanging about the body that guarantees your place in that social order. I think that way of thinking about bodies and the relationship of bodies to social roles and categories is something that comes out of the history of the transatlantic slave trade. I mean, that there were ideas about the body that were necessary to think of the body as kind of like a skin prison that says if you have that heritage, if you come from this place, if this is what your bodily phenotype is, that means you are X.
And that means that what we're doing to you is not bad.
Well, they might even think it could be bad. It just means it's kind of like it's nature. It's like, or that it's a social and legal, I would say metaphysical, construct of race.
Yeah.
Saying like there is a social system that fastens upon actual existing biological and physical differences to make the existence of that difference the thing that means this is your social place, not some other social place. If you have that heritage and look like this, then you are property, and you can be used to extract value from. That your labor is something that can be completely appropriated by somebody else. And so that's an idea that has a history. And that idea of developing the legal, philosophical, theological, whatever justifications for how you can make the body mean something to bind you in place as part of a larger geopolitical and economic structure, it's like the legacy of that is for trans people who say like, you know what? Our bodies can mean otherwise. It's like, I'm not in denial of my biology. It's that I'm saying it doesn't mean what you think. In the same way that, say, in the feminist movement, to say like, just because you have a uterus doesn't mean you have to be a mother and doesn't mean you're second-class citizens. Like there's bodily autonomy there. You can make the biology of your body mean something different. It's like trans people visibly manifest the fact that our bodies are not, in fact, stable anchors that bind us in an eternal social order. And in that sense, it's deeply, deeply destabilizing to the way society is now organized.
Oh, and so if I'm somebody who takes gender biology just as fact and unchangeable, that if you are contradicting that and saying, actually, it might be, then that makes me think I need to question everything I know to be a fact. And that's really, that's too much.
Or in that it kicks the ground out from under your own feet.
That's
there's like a sense of panic about it. Or there's just like a deeply internalized sense of like, if what you're saying is true, that makes my assumed privilege less secure. I mean, I think so much of this is unconscious. It's unthought. I also think because we're people who actually change genders are very small in number. We make a kind of a perfect scapegoat community.
I think for many years, the promise and the operating theory was that visibility would lead to acceptance, right? Just growing representation. And yet we have visibility now, and it's what we see playing out. So, was that theory wrong all along? Where do you see that?
I think visibility is just a two-edged sword. I mean, on the one hand, I do think it is important to manifest that trans is a thing that exists in the world. And on the other hand, I don't think visibility alone gets you anything. And certainly right now, I think to be visibly trans is very dangerous. I mean, it's a lot of the, we don't have time to get into it today, but a lot of the actions of the federal government since January 2025 are really designed to make trans impossible on paper, and increasingly to put people who are trans in these very unlivable and fraught conditions. But within that context, I think it's important for trans people to not disappear.
You said that the administration's making it more and more impossible to be trans on paper and harder to live a life off paper. Are there any tips or blueprints from history we can pull to for this moment?
I'm always leery of historical analogies because every situation is different. But I do think we're in a political moment right now that is without precedent, and I think certainly in the lives of most people who are alive right now. And that there's not, I think there are new threats that are emerging that have not existed in the past. I mean, the level of surveillance that happens now, the technological environment that we live in that allows so many of our movements and actions to be tracked, the use of emerging AI technologies to combine vast amounts of big data from government databases and compile very detailed records of individual people. It's that is a new power of the state. I mean, that it's not a new power of the state because it's states have always done that, but they're newly sophisticated, extensive, and invasive practices of policing and surveilling the population that make I think some previous ways of resisting less likely. So it's a moment where it's very difficult to decide where the ground is stable enough to move in that direction.
I think about that all the time, how previous resistance tactics, a lot of ACT UP stuff. There was the famous moment where they put a giant inflatable condom over a senator's house. Was it Jesse Helms, I think?
Yeah.
To protest him. And it was a big moment. Today, if they did that to a senator, that senator would fundraise off of it and make $1 million.
And in the climate that we're in right now, the people who did that, their vehicles would have been tracked, their license plates, would be in the database. There'd be facial recognition technology. You could compile the records of where they bought,
if they were immigrants,
products, whatever. Not even if they were immigrants. It's because we see what is happening right now with green card holders, with the suppression of political speech. If people did those kinds of actions to those kinds of targets now, they would be rotting in a jail in El Salvador within a week.
It's really dampened the protest movement.
Yeah, because you want to be careful that the way that you resist actually does something effective, that it's not merely symbolic, that it produces some kind of change. And it's very difficult to know exactly what is the best way of resisting or skirting or what. It's this is a really new, the targeting of minority populations through the police powers of the state is not a new thing, but new groups are being targeted by new means, new, more extensive means. And that new part is what makes it very difficult to figure out.
Have you experienced a change in your own day-to-day life?
Yeah, I know that I've been specifically targeted by some well-funded right-wing actors using my name to do Freedom of Information Act requests, trying to track relationships between trans academics. I mean, there's things that I have written as a historian that have been taken down from government websites. I've tried to invite people, or I've been planning to invite people to the U.S. for seminars and symposia, in the academy. And, it's like I have had to say to them, I don't think it's safe for you to come because of the way that the State Department has essentially created a de facto travel ban for gender incongruent people coming into the United States. I'm supposed to travel out of the U.S. again in June, and I'm keeping an eye on it. I'm listening, are trans people trying to leave the U.S.? Are they having their documents confiscated? Are they perhaps not being allowed back in the U.S.? It's like I haven't seen those stories yet, but I'm listening for them, because if some things that are already happening at the state level happen at the federal level, it's like is bad. To the idea that asserting a trans identity is identity fraud. It's to say for me to say I am a woman, my name is Susan Stryker. Would be considered identity fraud, and that I would have obtained documentation under fraudulent, misrepresenting myself. And if the federal government decides that, and I show up with my legitimately issued U.S. passport, and I say that was the before times, this is now.
And that's happened in Florida and other states. You're saying this might happen federally.
Right. So, there are, at the state level, there's laws being passed or advocated for that would make the assertion of a transgender identity an act of identity fraud, right? There are also already in visa applications for people coming into the U.S. It's like they're in an impossible situation, because the new rule is that you have to state on your visa application assigned sex and name at birth. And so if you even show your passport, your birth certificate, or whatever from the country of origin, where it's you might have changed your markers, the U.S. is saying it doesn't fly here. This is what we need. And so if you said on your visa application, this is my name, this is my gender, as I live it now, they would say that's identity fraud for purpose of, immigration, fraud, and they would just deny the visa and bar you from coming to the U.S. However, if you did say, here's my birth name, assigned sex at birth, and then you present documentation that's incongruent with that, then you sort of get flagged as trans and perpetrating gender ideology and woke mind virus, and you're an enemy of the state, and they're not going to let you come in either. And so there is a de facto, without saying no gender incongruent people can come to the U.S., they have created the administrative mechanism where that's possible. So when will those things be applied to citizens as well as visitors? Because they're already going after visa holders who are already here. They're already going after green card holders, naturalized citizens. It's like they are creating this state apparatus that allows certain kinds of minoritized life to be discriminated against at will. We are living in a police state now.
Yeah. That's incredibly sobering, and I have to let you go. It's a hard place to end on, but thank you for the conversation. This was fantastic.
You're welcome. I don't want to end on a bad note, but that's life right now.
And that is Susan Stryker. She is the author of the books Transgender History and her new collection, When Monsters Speak. And then as just a quick reminder, we do have a Substack newsletter if you want to check that out. I post some behind-the-scenes moments there. I share photos from the interviews. Now, the Substack is free, so please go to the link in our show notes and sign up. But yes, if you do want to support the work we do here, there is a paid subscription option. Making a show like this, it involves doing a ton of research to figure out who to talk to, then booking those guests, prepping for the interviews, reading everything they've ever written, recording in a studio, editing it all after. It takes an enormous amount of time and, yes, money. So if you're able to, your contribution can help to make sure that we can, 1, continue recording these stories, these histories for years to come, and 2, more importantly, it ensures that this show can stay free for everyone. So thank you so much to everyone who has joined us there. Thank you so much to everyone who signed up. And once again, there's a link to the Substack in our show notes, but if you need it, that link is LGBTQpod, that's LGBTQpod.substack.com/subscribe. All right, thank you so much to everyone for listening. I'm Jeffrey Masters. I'll see you next time. Stay safe. Bye.